Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is picking social media fights with some prominent Quebec mayors. Following a report from Canada's Mortgage and Housing Corporation that showed a dip in the number of homes being built in the province last year, Poilievre posted the following. Massive drop in construction in Quebec while Trudeau pays billions to incompetent mayors Marchand and Plante, who block construction sites. Federal money for cities will be tied to the number of houses and apartments built when I am Prime Minister. That drew this response from Montreal Mayor Valérie Plante. Before calling anyone incompetent, Mr. Poilievre should understand that in Quebec, federal funding for housing does not go through the cities. And Quebec City Mayor Bruno Marchand wrote, Poilievre's common sense is to insult the elected representatives of Quebec. It's petty politics. Quebec does not deserve this contempt. While the Prime Minister says he's disappointed in Poilievre's display of scorn for elected officials in Quebec.
For a number of times now, he has shown a very condescending attitude towards them and towards the way things operate between the federal government and the province. And I think it's high time that he apologized for his behavior.
Okay, so what are the politics driving this spat? We're going to discuss that with our Friday Power Panel. Nigan Sinclair is a columnist for the Winnipeg Free Press and a professor of Indigenous Studies at the University of Manitoba. The CBC's Jason Markusoff is getting connected there. He's going to join us from Calgary. And here with me, journalist and author Paul Wells and Susan Delacour, national columnist for the Toronto Star. Happy Friday, gang. Paul, you know, when you want to when you want to woo people, calling them incompetent is not necessarily the way to do it. But as it was explained to me by Jonathan Kalis, a Liberal operative who was on the show last night, is that by picking the fight with the mayors of Quebec and Montreal, you appeal to all the people around Quebec City and Montreal who may not like the mayors who are seen as too progressive, and maybe that's the play.
Yeah, and
what's going on?
And even potentially all the people in Montreal and Quebec City who are never going to get to be mayor. He is
a lot of people.
He is the champion of the little guy and little gal, and he was telegraphing that a little bit.
Right.
To the extent he's got a and also, I mean, he was in Quebec City, I believe, yesterday. One can never tell from social media. At Schwa FM, which is Radio X. It's the talk radio station in Quebec City that is the gathering spot for all people who are likely to vote Poilievre.
Right.
So I think he was doing a little song and dance to let people know that their guy was in town. Housing starts were lousy in Quebec City and Montreal last year, down 37% in Montreal from the year before, worst in the country. The thing that so he's like, you know, he's Mr. Housing and they have.
No, I get the issue for sure.
Housing starts are down in Montreal from a historic 30-year high in 2021, and that wasn't just a COVID thing because housing starts doubled in 2019 over the previous year. So housing goes up, housing goes down. He's got a bill that would punish you in a good year and in a bad year and reward you in a good year. By my count, if that law had been in place for the last 5 years, Montreal would have been rewarded half the time and punished half the time, and so what's the point?
Well, that's an interesting take on the policy. On the politics of this, though, Susan, I would point out, I was speaking with Louis Blouin, who's is the main guy in our ragcan operations here in Ottawa. You know, criticism of Quebec, criticism of Quebec City, criticism of Montreal, praise for Trois-Rivières, praise for Saguenay, praise for Victoriaville, the mayors in particular. Conservatives like to run mayors in the rural seats in Quebec. I mean, is that the play here? What's going on?
Well, you know, first of all, Paul is too modest to mention. Much of what I know about the policy on this, I do know because of Paul's latest post
today. Yeah.
Very good. So some of the points I've been thinking about this reverberate in Paul's piece too. One is, if you want to know what Pierre Poilievre, when he feels like he's made a mistake, watch for him doubling down. And he has doubled down. He decided in the wake of that, I don't just hate the mayors of Montreal and Quebec. I don't think they're incompetent. I also think Toronto and Vancouver mayors are also incompetent. So there is a little bit of a big city, I'm a small town guy, but there is also, I think he realizes it was a bit of an error.
Particularly, though, progressive mayors, Chow and Kennedy Stewart, the former NDP MP, former defeated mayor of Vancouver.
The other thing I think it's worth noting, and I've noticed this more and more about Pierre Poilievre, is he's very good at communications he controls. He's not so good when he doesn't control them. He is very quick on the trigger. He's not great at press conferences, as we know. He's got a hot temper. And I think when his impetuousness gets the best of him. So I'm imagining we won't see him do this again, but for now he's doubling down because that's how you tell when he's made a mistake.
Nigan, do you think this would be the last of it? I mean, whatever, you know, the point he's trying to make on housing, and maybe some of these mayors are being obstructionist on housing. That is not an uncommon thing at the municipal level, as we're seeing. But for the guy who wants to be prime minister potentially in under 2 years, to be calling municipal leaders incompetent in a public forum like that, what do we make just of the tone and the decision-making behind that approach?
No, I think your point around who he's attacking, which mayors he's attacking, is key. And I want to slightly disagree with Susan. I mean, I think he, for his base, they think he does great in press conferences. And I think he particularly, prides himself on being able to call out sort of progressive people, both in his press conferences. And so going after progressive mayors is a pretty logical conclusion. Here's what I would say about this move. Last summer, there was a poll by Nanos which said that Poilievre had gained almost 40% of the 18 to 29-year-old crowd support. And mostly it involved the other 30% that was moving away from the Liberals towards the NDP, were young people who were looking for failures of the Liberals for climate change, but the ones who were turning to the Conservatives was about affordability. We have seen these two mayors in Quebec City and Montreal, their policies involving progressive housing, affordable housing. These are not making impacts. Housing developers in those cities are willing to pay fines instead of building affordable housing, which is an option in Quebec. And so young people are seeing these mayors as having their housing policies failing. So I'm not surprised at all that Poilievre would call these mayors incompetent, because he's really going after that youth vote. He sees there's a softness within the Liberals of gaining their final 15 or so % of that youth vote, which carried them to elections in the past. And I think he sees that there is a large segment of conservative, disenchanted voters with the NDP who think they'll never own a home, and he can appeal to these voters in these houses. I think this is a calculated play in some weird way, that he thinks that he'll gain some foothold in Quebec, in urban Quebec, by going after mayors by simply talking about housing.
Well, Jason, they've certainly had a ceiling, in Quebec that the Liberals have the Conservatives, have tried to shatter, unsuccessfully in the last couple of elections. What's your assessment of this approach?
I mean, within Quebec, while he was criticizing the mayors of Quebec City and Montreal, he was also tweeting praise for the mayors of Saguenay, Poilievre, and Victoriaville, areas where the Conservatives may play better. But with the story like this, he's got to realize that everybody's watching him, and he's if he's the prime minister in waiting. And the headlines he winds up getting on this mention very little bit housing, or they mention housing later on, after they talk about, he called somebody incompetent. He called mayors, he called elected officials incompetent. We're not used to seeing prime ministers or prime ministers in waiting saying those things. Canada, largely rejects that kind of smash mouth. Mood, but to conservative fans, hey, now he's an all-star with this sort of stuff. He likes bad Friday pun.
You workshopped that all day, didn't you?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
I'll just leave now, I guess. It plays well to the base, and sometimes he's going to give stuff to the base at the detriment of at the risk of losing credibility with, or losing ground for other people in the broader public. And this might be that moment. It was really interesting to note, to Susan's point about his criticism that he put out there about Toronto and Vancouver mayors, was that he was recalling 2022 messages, kind of in a way of saying to Montreal and Quebec, see guys, I've been critical of other people too. I've called them boobs too in the past, so I'm not doing anything too crazy and new, although in the past he just called them gatekeepers. Right. So I don't know if he'll, there'll probably be cases where this rhetoric comes up in the future. He'll tone it down, pick it up, crank it up. It's various audiences and various moods, and bad ska band puns.
Right. Paul, I am tempted to pivot to an analysis of the Smash Mouth efforts there by Jason. But on this, it's is this a feature of a potential future government? Like, how would federal-provincial relations go? I mean, you disagree with the premier. Does it become like social media? Like, in a future Prime Minister Poilievre, potentially, do we see this when there's disagreement with the premier of, I don't know, Nova Scotia, Saskatchewan, BC? Yeah,
so on that point, federal-provincial relations never improve. I remember when everyone thought John Chrétien was just a curse on federalism, and it turns out, in retrospect, was kind of a golden era. So,
they can get worse, I guess is my
yeah. Let's give the guy, I think, some realistic benefit of the doubt. We can parse the detail. I spent hours reading his damn private member's bill last night, and then I remembered that governments never implement their opposition bills.
Right.
If there's a prime minister and everyone knows that he's impatient with delays in housing starts, I suspect housing starts would go up. And the rest is sort of salon talk. Like, I can't match Jason because all of my references are to the second Miles Davis quintet.
Right.
So, like, if everyone knows the prime minister thinks it's important, I think that would actually have an influence.
Susan, what do you think?
Doesn't it just replace one gatekeeper with another? That's as long as he's been talking about this, he's saying, I'm going to remove the gatekeepers and be a gatekeeper myself.
Well, it's a level of micromanagement at the municipal level that would be very difficult to execute
Yeah.
from here in Ottawa, isn't it?
Yeah, you notice that I don't even want to weigh in on whether this hurts him, because I feel like we're living in another universe now where you can pretty much say anything and insult anyone, and nobody's paying many political prices for it anymore. Maybe that's a casualty of Trump or social media. That's too big for a discussion on a Friday at 5:30, but I don't know whether this is going to hurt him. And it's always been the case with Poilievre since he's been leader. He says the things that the Harper folks used to say behind this, whisper about, the media, the Laurentian elites and all that stuff. He says it out loud. And it so far isn't hurting him.
It's actually helping him. It's helping him.
Go on that point, Nigam. Why do you say that?
Oh, well, I mean, I think that this could be a source or evidence of, out here in the West, Poilievre, when he turns against the Quebec, Ontario, calls out, gains a lot of foothold and a whole lot of headlines out here in the West. And I think that there may be some moments perhaps that he really picks out those to go after to be able to get footholds in those kinds of things I spoke about before, youth vote, disenchanted youth votes, those who are feeling Western alienation. But, I mean, I spent the afternoon sort of analyzing the way that Quebec housing market works. We haven't spent a lot of time talking about the fact that Poilievre's idea, or his idea of trying to control housing, just simply won't fly in Quebec because the federal government can't work with municipalities. They have to involve the provincial government. And the fact that he's just down wrong in his policy developments, that might be something that we might want to talk about, in that he's offering an idea that is factually incorrect, even though it may politically gain forces, and that may be his strategy overall.
Yeah, Jason, just as a final point on that is one of the challenges here, right? That what he is proposing as a solution bumps up against jurisdiction, and outside of, you're in the land of the Sovereignty Act, the land of attempted sovereignty referendums, that is a dynamite political issue.
Absolutely. While in Quebec there's restrictions on how much federal ministers can intervene with cities. Here, they're reaching their separate deals in Calgary and Edmonton and other cities on housing, on several other issues. You're getting the sense that Danielle Smith has and will push back more on that. Certainly Scott Moe is pushing on that. If there's a Conservative Prime Minister, will those Conservative premiers be playing the same turf wars, or does this become a bit more political and partisan? If in reality, it's fine if a Conservative does it, and we kind of like what they do.
Right, or more brokerage, who knows.